Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, and this is my third reading from Psychological Types. I'm just going to jump right into it. See the theological disputes of the ancient church. It is more than probable that the contrast of types will also be found in the history of the schisms and heresies that were so frequent in the disputes of the early church. Going to mispronounce some things here. The Ebionites, or Jewish Christians, who were probably identical with the primitive Christians generally, believed in the exclusive humanity of Christ and held him to be the son of Mary and Joseph. Sorry, distracting myself. Only subsequently receiving his consecration through the Holy Ghost. On this point, the Ebionites were diametrically opposed to the Docetists. The effects of this opposition endured long after. The conflict came to light again in an altered form, which, though doctrinally attenuated, had an even graver effect on church politics about the year 320 in the Arian heresy. Arius denied the formula propounded by the Orthodox Church. Homoousia of one substance with the Father, in favor of homoousia of like substance with the Father. So already we have this idea that throughout history, at different levels other than merely individually, we can see the contrast of various typological preferences. And I think for Jung, these type preferences aren't merely limited to functional disputes or attitudinal disputes between extroversion and introversion. You might have like a materialistic type, and maybe that doesn't neatly map onto the functional ideas that we're familiar with. In any case, I think that I'm not articulating this point well, but hopefully it comes back up as we move on. And so during these great schisms and arguments about what makes sense doctrinally, he's saying that in those little fissures, it makes sense that type preferences will start to color and inform the way that those schisms divide. So early Christians believed that Jesus was straight up human and only became sacred after the fact, whereas maybe the Docetists mentioned here believed that his divine nature was implicit from the get-go. I'm not sure, but these arguments were then resurrected, no pun intended, by this guy Arius, and then we have these two different formulations. Is Jesus of one substance with the Father, or is he of like substance? Of one substance, I think of an apple. To say that they are of one substance, you'd be saying that Jesus and God are the same apple. Of like substance, you'd say, hey, I have this really special apple of divinity that is God. And look, I found this other apple. They are of similar substance without being the exact same thing. Any case, let's move on. When we examine more clearly the history of the great Arian controversy concerning homoousia and homoousia, the complete identity as against the similarity of Christ's substance with God, it seems to us that this is going to be tough. We'll say of like substance definitely puts the accent on the sensuous and humanly perceptible, in contrast to the purely conceptual and abstract standpoint of one substance. Like, I found a way to make it work. In the same way, it would appear to us that the revolt of the monophysites, who upheld the absolute unity of Christ's nature, against the diophysite formula of the Council of Chalcedon, which upheld the inseparable duality of Christ. So we have unity versus duality, his human and divine nature coexisting in one body, once more asserted the standpoint of the abstract and inconceivable as against the sensuous and naturalistic formula of the Diophysites. So let's think about this for a second. We're saying of one substance, then what we're saying is somehow a conceptual, more abstract standpoint. If we're saying of like substance, and we're granting Jesus a material, sensuous, and humanly perceptible reality that is therefore independent of his relationship to the greater divine. At the same time, it becomes overwhelmingly clear to us that in the Arian movement, as in the monophysite dispute, although the subtle dogmatic question was the main issue for the minds that originally conceived it, this was not so for the great mass of people who took part in the controversy. Even in those early days, so subtle a question had no motivating force with the masses, who were stirred rather by the problems and claims of political power that had nothing to do with differences of theological opinion. Yeah, people, the masses, typically don't care for these hair-splitting distinctions. If type differences had any significance at all here, it was merely because they provided catchwords that gave a flattering label to the crude instincts of the mass. That's interesting because I think that that's also kind of a phenomenon that we're seeing now in this age of social media, where your viewing patterns and your purchasing patterns are being tracked to the point that your habits can be distilled down into an algorithm and can be fed back to you in this way that captures your instincts and only reinforces a particular worldview. Something to think about. That's my lesson for the day. But this should in no way blind us to the fact that for those who kindled the quarrel, these two standpoints were a very serious matter, for concealed within it, both historically and psychologically, lay the Ebionite creed of a purely human Christ with only relative apparent divinity, and the Docetist creed of a purely divine Christ with only apparent corporeality. So this kind of sums up that distinction in a really easy to grasp way. We see someone who is human and therefore material, and someone who is divine and whose materiality is more of an appendage, more of an afterthought, not really the main event, so to speak. So material versus abstract. What were the phrases used before? Abstract and inconceivable versus sensuous and naturalistic. So that's interesting because I never really thought about this and I didn't really catch it when I was reading it the first time, but essentially what he's saying is even these theological disputes can be boiled down to what people are accenting psychologically, because the conceptual formulations that people form, as we learned in the last chapter, the data itself is not sufficient to determine the concepts that we use. So the concepts are an added layer informed by the personal equation determined by your psyche. And beneath this level, in turn, lies the great psychological schism. The one position attaches supreme value and importance to the sensuously perceptible, whose subject, though it may not always be human and personal, is nevertheless always a projected human sensation. The other maintains that the chief value lies with the abstract and extra-human, whose subject is the function. I'm not sure what that means. In other words, with the objective process of nature that runs its course determined by impersonal law beyond human sensation, of which it is the actual foundation. So we're inflecting on the archetypal abstract basis of sensory reality. The former standpoint overlooks the function in favor of the function complex, if man may be so regarded. The latter overlooks man as the indispensable subject in favor of the function. I see. So we're thinking about the function as in the function that he plays in this conceptual scheme and not, again, the material man. and we see the man as being equivalent to the function complex, meaning this is interesting because it makes sense based on how Jung talks about archetypes and complexes. Psychological complexes, according to Jung, have their basis and are grounded in archetypes. So here we have the function as like an abstracted archetype, and then we have the complex as a manifestation of a deeper process. Each standpoint denies the principal value of the other. The more resolutely the adherents of either standpoint identify themselves with it, the more they strive, with the best intentions perhaps, to force it on the other and thereby violate the other's supreme value. And this is why he calls it the problem of types, as far as I'm concerned. It's about this seemingly eternal conflict and human striving to override another person's stated values or implicit values and force yours onto them. It's something that happens even in modern typological disputes. We can't help but want to take our mode of being as the default and then inflict that upon unsuspecting others. Another aspect of the type conflict appears in the Pelagian controversy at the beginning of the 5th century, the experience so profoundly felt by Tertullian that man cannot avoid sin even after baptism grew with Augustine, who in many ways was not unlike Tertullian, into that thoroughly characteristic pessimistic doctrine of original sin, whose essence consists in the, these words, let's look it up.
Concupiscence.
Concupiscence. Whose essence consists in the concupiscence inherited from Adam. Concupiscence apparently means strong sexual desire. So apparently that's where the source of original sin is. Over against the fact of original sin there stood, according to Augustine, the redeeming grace of God, with the institution of the church ordained by his grace to administer the means of salvation. In the scheme of things, the value of man stands very low. He is really nothing but a miserable, wretched creature who is delivered over to the devil under all circumstances, unless through the medium of the church, the sole means of salvation. Unless through the church he is made a participator of the divine grace. Not only man's value, but his moral freedom and self-determination crumbled away accordingly, with the result that the value and significance of the church as an idea were so much the more enhanced as was altogether in keeping with Augustine's explicit program and the Civitas Dei. Against such a stifling conception, there rises ever anew the feeling of man's freedom and moral value, a feeling that will not long endure suppression, whether by insight however searching or logic however keen. The rightness of the feeling of human value found its defenders in Pelagius, a British monk, and Celestius, his pupil. Their teaching was founded on the moral freedom of man as a given fact. It is characteristic of the psychological kinship existing between the Pelagian standpoint and the Diophysite view that the persecuted Pelagians found an advocate in Nestorius, the metropolitan of Constantinople. Nestorius stressed the separation of the two natures of Christ in contrast to the Cyrillian doctrine, of the physical oneness of Christ as the God-man. Also, Nestorius definitely did not want Mary to be understood as the God-bearer, but merely as the Christ-bearer. With some justification, he even called the idea that Mary was the mother of God heathenish. From him originated the Nestorian controversy, which finally ended with the secession of the Nestorian church. All right, so I'm not going to summarize this one too much because I think I've done a good job of summarizing it as I've gone. I do want to try to make a little more sense of these last couple of paragraphs. So we're seeing another typological conflict with Augustine, who essentially created this this doctrine of original sin, which is that we inherited some sort of excessive desire and lust from Adam, and the only thing that really saved us was the grace of God, and the church was the sole means of administering that grace. So in this particular scheme, man is somehow belittled, is stripped of a lot of agency, and the church was the only means of salvation. So how does that connect to some of the typological ideas we've talked about? Well, I guess ultimately we have, maybe we could split this into a binary of self-determination versus wretched lowliness, powerlessness. Maybe we can connect it to the idea previously mentioned of how of one mode is a little more material and one mode is a little more emphasizing the abstract or the spiritual. So in this case, with the church and the church being the dispenser of grace and salvation, that's a little more abstracted, that's a little higher, and that which is material is therefore suppressed and assigned a lower value. Then we see that some folks ended up defending the moral freedom of man. And right. This guy Nestorius kind of helped out here with defending the moral freedom. He actually stressed the separation of the two natures of Christ. So he's maybe restoring a little balance to this theological picture by saying, okay, we have a spiritual dimension and a material dimension, and we want to maintain that distinction. We want to talk about Mary not as the mother of God, but as the mother of the Son of God. And that it would be weird to say that a mortal, material human was the bearer and carrier of something divine. So that about sums it up. I'm going to keep this one short. That was yet another example of how these typological disputes play out and inform the entire intellectual legacy of my culture anyway. I don't want to say your culture. I don't know what your culture is, but regardless, I hope that you've gotten something out of the video, and I'm going to call it. So catch you next time.